Imagine losing everything, your home, your memories, and even your sense of purpose. Earl, a 70-year-old widower, thought his son was taking him to a nursing home, sealing his fears of being a burden forever. But what awaited him on this emotional journey was beyond anything he could have imagined. A story of love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of family. Will Earl find his way back to where he truly belongs? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Earl Patterson's room, casting thin streaks of gold across the floor. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped, staring at the photo of his late wife Carol, resting on the nightstand. The faint hum of a lawnmower outside mingled with the sound of children's laughter in the distance. It should have been a comforting moment, but to Earl, it felt like the silence before a storm. Something was changing in the Patterson household, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Earl's once active life had slowed to a crawl since he moved in with Marcus and Denise 2 years ago. The family home he had shared with Carol had become too much to maintain after her passing. Marcus, his adopted son, insisted that he come live with them in Montgomery. Earl had agreed reluctantly, holding on to the last shreds of his independence. But as time passed, he began to feel like an outsider in their bustling home. The sound of Marcus's voice carried from the kitchen downstairs. Earl strained to listen but couldn't make out the words. A moment later he heard Denise's softer tone, but her words were similarly muffled. He caught only fragments, getting everything ready, and soon. Earl's stomach tightened. The conversations had been happening more frequently lately, hushed and hurried. He didn't need to hear the full sentences to sense that he was the topic. Earl shuffled to the window, glancing out at the street. A neighbor was walking their dog, and the familiar sight brought a fleeting comfort. The view reminded him of the neighborhood he and Carol had lived in for 40 years, where the neighbors knew each other by name and Sunday dinners were a tradition. That world seemed so far away now. "Earl, breakfast is ready," Denise's voice broke his train of thought. He made his way downstairs, his knees aching with every step. The aroma of bacon and eggs greeted him, but it wasn't enough to lift his spirits. At the table, Marcus was scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging Earl's presence. Denise handed Earl a plate with a warm smile that felt more like a polite gesture than genuine affection. "How are you feeling this morning, Dad?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Fine," Earl replied curtly, picking at his food. "How are the kids?" "They're good," Denise said brightly, excited about their soccer game this weekend. Marcus finally looked up. "You should come, Dad. It'd be good for you to get out for a bit." Earl forced a smile. "We'll see." The truth was, he didn't feel like he belonged in their world anymore. Marcus and Denise were kind, but their lives were full. Careers, kids, friends. Earl felt like a guest overstaying his welcome. Later that day, Earl sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His thoughts drifted back to Carol and the life they had built together. He thought about the sacrifices they made to raise Marcus. How Carol had been the glue that held their family together. Without her, the thread seemed to be unraveling. A familiar voice called out, breaking the quiet evening. "Mr. Patterson, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." It was Bernice White, his neighbor. She was walking up the driveway with a casserole dish in her hands. Earl chuckled lightly. "Just thinking, Bernice. Well, thinking too much will give you wrinkles, and I don't think you need any more of those." She handed him the dish. "Made you something. Thought you could use a little home cooking." "Thank you," Earl said, genuinely touched. Bernice had been a lifeline in many ways, offering a sense of familiarity in a world that felt increasingly foreign. As Bernice turned to leave, she paused. "You know, I was talking to a friend the other day. She just moved into one of those retirement communities. Said it's the best thing she ever did. No pressure on the kids, lots of people her age. Might be worth considering." Earl stiffened but managed a polite nod. "I'll think about it." That night, as Earl lay in bed, her words echoed in his mind. The idea of a nursing home had always felt like an admission of failure to him, but lately he wondered if it might be the best solution. He hated feeling like a burden to Marcus and Denise. Maybe this was the answer, for everyone. The faint sound of laughter drifted up from the living room. Earl closed his eyes, his heart heavy. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask Marcus about it. It was time to face the inevitable. The night was restless for Earl. Sleep came in fits and starts, his mind racing with memories of Carol and the home they had shared. The thought of bringing up the idea of a nursing home to Marcus weighed heavily on him. As the early morning light crept into his room, Earl rose, feeling the ache in his bones, a familiar companion now. He glanced at Carol's photograph, her smile frozen in time, and let out a weary sigh. Sitting by the window, Earl reached for an old shoebox tucked away on the nearby shelf. Inside were pieces of his past, faded photographs, yellowing newspaper clippings, and a few treasured letters. Among them was the adoption certificate for Marcus. Earl traced the edges of the document, his mind wandering back to the day everything changed. It was over 4 decades ago in a small courthouse in Mobile, Alabama. Carol had insisted they adopt Marcus after his birth mother, a struggling young woman, decided she couldn't provide for him. Earl had hesitated at first. Raising another man's child felt daunting, especially when they were just getting by themselves. But when Marcus first wrapped his tiny fingers around Earl's thumb, something shifted. "He's ours now," Carol had said, her voice full of conviction, and Earl had promised himself he would do right by the boy. The photos told their story, the fishing trips, the birthdays, the lazy Sunday afternoons when Marcus would climb into Earl's lap, holding a book too big for his small hands. Earl remembered the first time Marcus called him Dad. It had been a simple word, but it carried a weight that Earl felt in his chest. That day, he truly understood what it meant to be a father, but the years hadn't been easy. Earl and Carol worked tirelessly to provide for their small family. Earl took on extra shifts at the school, scrubbing floors and fixing leaky faucets, while Carol worked as a seamstress. They had built a life out of love and sacrifice, filling their modest home with warmth and laughter. Earl's chest tightened as he remembered the garden they had planted together where Carol's roses bloomed every spring. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Denise poked her head in, her expression soft. "Morning, Dad. Breakfast will be ready in a bit." "Thanks," Earl replied, folding the adoption certificate and placing it back in the box. He hesitated before adding, "Denise, do you think Marcus is happy with how things are? With me living here, I mean." Denise stepped into the room, her brow furrowing. "Of course he's happy. Your family, Dad. We're glad to have you here." Earl nodded, though her words did little to ease his doubt. After she left, he sat back in his chair, staring out the window. The neighborhood was waking up. Cars pulling out of driveways, kids waiting for the school bus. It was a world Earl once felt part of, but now it seemed to move without him. Later that morning, Earl ventured into the attic. It had been years since he'd gone through the old boxes stored there, but something compelled him to revisit them. Among the dusty cartons, he found a bundle wrapped in a plaid blanket. Inside was Carol's favorite quilt, her perfume faint but still there, and a small album filled with pictures of their life in Mobile. The memories poured out: Marcus's first day of school, Carol teaching him how to bake cookies, the time they all got caught in a summer storm and laughed until their sides hurt. As he flipped through the album, Earl paused on a photo of Marcus as a young man, his arms slung around Earl's shoulders. It had been taken on the day Marcus graduated from high school. Earl remembered the pride he felt watching his son cross the stage, the same boy he once rocked to sleep, now on the cusp of his own life. But something else lingered in that memory, a quiet fear that one day Marcus might not need him anymore. Earl had tried to ignore it then, but now, sitting alone in the attic, it felt like that fear had come true. He closed the album gently, setting it aside. As he descended the stairs, Earl resolved to have the conversation with Marcus that evening. It was time to put his worries to rest one way or another. The attic memories lingered in Earl's mind as he shuffled out of the house for his morning walk. The cool Alabama air carried a faint hint of dew, and the neighborhood slowly came alive with the sounds of birds chirping and engines starting. Earl's steps were deliberate, his mind heavy with the decision he was gearing up to make. He'd planned to ask Marcus about the nursing home tonight, but a part of him dreaded the conversation. Memories of Carol and the life they built together still tugged at him, making the idea of leaving behind what remained of their family even harder to bear. Earl made his way to the park down the street, a familiar path he took every morning. It was one of the few things that brought him peace these days, watching the sun rise over the small pond, the ducks gliding effortlessly on the surface, and the occasional nod from other early risers. Today, however, his routine took an unexpected turn. "Morning, Patterson," a voice called out from a nearby bench. Earl turned to see Hank Richards, a retired mailman who'd become a regular fixture at the park. Hank was a tall, wiry man with a weathered face that hinted at years spent under the Alabama sun. He tipped his cap with a grin as Earl approached. "Hank," Earl replied with a faint smile, sitting down beside him. "What brings you out so early?" "Same as you, I reckon," Hank said, leaning back on the bench. "Trying to clear my head before the day gets the best of me. Something tells me you've got a lot on your mind this morning." Earl let out a sigh, staring at the pond. "It's nothing, really. Just thinking about some decisions I've got to make." Hank nodded knowingly. "Decisions, huh? Those tend to weigh heavier the older we get. Want to talk about it?" Earl hesitated, but there was something about Hank's easy demeanor that made him open up. "It's my son, Marcus. I think it's time I moved into a nursing home. Don't want to be a burden to him and his wife anymore." Hank let out a low whistle. "A nursing home, huh? That's a big step. But tell me this, are you sure that's what they want, or is it what you think they want?" The question caught Earl off guard. He shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "I don't know. Marcus is busy, always working. Denise too. They've got their own lives to worry about. I just feel like I'm in the way." Hank tilted his head, considering Earl's words. "Listen, Patterson, I've got 3 kids of my own, and let me tell you something. Family doesn't see you as a burden unless you tell yourself you are. Have you talked to Marcus about how you feel? Really talk to him." Earl shook his head, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. "I tried. He says he's got a lot on his plate right now, but he doesn't give me a straight answer. It's like he doesn't want to talk about it." "Maybe he's got his reasons," Hank said thoughtfully. "But I'll say this, sometimes we old folks are too quick to jump to conclusions. You raised that boy, right? You gave him everything you had. Maybe it's time to trust that he's doing the same for you, in his own way." Earl sat in silence, Hank's words stirring something in him. He had always prided himself on being the one to take care of others, but maybe it was time to let someone else return the favor. Before Earl could respond, Hank stood, brushing off his trousers. "Tell you what, next time you feel like you're in the way, just remember, love isn't about keeping score. It's about showing up, and from what I've seen, your son's been showing up for you." With a parting nod, Hank walked off, leaving Earl alone with his thoughts. The park suddenly felt quieter, the sounds of the morning more distant. Earl watched the ducks glide across the pond, their movements calm and unhurried, and thought about what Hank had said. Maybe he was jumping to conclusions. Maybe there was more to Marcus's silence than Earl had allowed himself to see. As Earl headed back home, the idea of the nursing home still lingered, but it no longer felt as certain. Perhaps there was another way, another conversation to be had. For the first time in weeks, Earl felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. Earl returned home from his walk feeling lighter than he had in days. Hank's words replayed in his mind, their wisdom cutting through the fog of doubt that had consumed him. Maybe he had been too quick to assume Marcus and Denise wanted him gone. Maybe they were simply trying to balance their busy lives. Still, the weight of uncertainty lingered, and as Earl climbed the stairs to his room, he resolved to look for signs, anything that might confirm or dispel his fears. The following morning, Earl woke to the sound of laughter drifting up from the kitchen. For a fleeting moment, he thought Carol's voice was among them, her warm laugh mingling with Marcus's deep chuckle. But when he opened his eyes, reality settled in. Carol was gone, and today was his 70th birthday. Earl got dressed slowly, his joints stiff but his mind preoccupied. He had no expectations for the day. Birthdays had become quiet affairs in recent years, and he didn't blame Marcus or Denise for that. Life was busy, and people moved on. Still, a small part of him clung to the hope that they might do something to mark the occasion. A card, a favorite meal, maybe even a family dinner. When he reached the kitchen, Marcus was already dressed for work, his phone pressed to his ear. Denise greeted Earl with her usual smile, placing a mug of coffee in front of him. "Morning, Dad. Happy birthday," she said cheerfully before turning back to the stove. "Thanks," Earl replied, his voice low. He glanced at Marcus, who ended his call and finally looked up. "Happy birthday, Dad," Marcus said, walking over to pat Earl on the shoulder. "Sorry I can't stay long, big project at work. We'll celebrate properly this weekend, okay?" Earl forced a smile. "Sure, son, I understand." Within minutes, Marcus was out the door, leaving Denise to finish breakfast. She set a plate of eggs and toast in front of Earl before sitting down with her own coffee. "We'll do something nice this weekend," she assured him. "The kids have been working on a little surprise for you." "That's kind of them," Earl said, though his tone betrayed his disappointment. He ate in silence, his appetite waning with each bite. Later in the day, Earl found himself sitting on the porch, staring out at the street. The hours passed slowly, punctuated only by the occasional hum of a passing car or the chatter of a neighbor walking their dog. The weight of the day pressed down on him, his thoughts turning once again to Carol. She had always made his birthday special, no matter how simple the celebration. Her absence felt sharper today, like a wound that refused to heal. In the late afternoon, a familiar figure approached the house. Mildred Johnson, his kind but blunt neighbor, held a small plate covered with foil. "Happy birthday, Earl," she said, handing him the plate. "Made you some peach cobbler. Thought you could use a little sweetness today." Earl smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "Thank you, Mildred. That's very thoughtful of you." Mildred sat beside him, her sharp eyes studying his face. "You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders. Something on your mind?" Earl hesitated before shaking his head. "Just another day, Mildred. Nothing to fuss about," she snorted. "Don't give me that. You're a good man, Earl. You deserve more than just another day." As she left, Earl felt a pang of gratitude for her words. Still, the emptiness lingered. That evening, he sat alone in the living room, the untouched cobbler on the coffee table. He thought about Marcus's promise to celebrate later and wondered if it was more of an excuse than a genuine plan. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock. Earl closed his eyes, his heart heavy. Birthdays, it seemed, were no longer a time for celebration. They were just another reminder of how much had changed. The evening of Earl's birthday stretched long and quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. He sat in his armchair, the untouched peach cobbler Mildred had given him resting on the coffee table. The gift had been thoughtful, but it was a stark reminder of what was missing. No candles, no laughter, no family gathering to mark 70 years of life. Earl's chest tightened with a mix of sadness and frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to feel, to grow old and be surrounded by family yet still feel so utterly alone. As the clock struck 9, Earl heard the door click open. Marcus entered, his shoulders slumped, his tie loosened. He looked exhausted but offered a faint smile when he saw Earl. "Hey, Dad, you're still up?" Earl straightened, his gaze steady. "Couldn't sleep." Marcus nodded, walking toward the kitchen. Earl hesitated, but something inside him snapped. He had been putting off this conversation for too long, letting his doubts fester. Tonight, he would get answers. "Marcus," Earl called, his voice firmer than he expected. Marcus stopped in the doorway, turning back with a questioning look. "Yeah? Sit down. We need to talk." Marcus hesitated but complied, pulling out a chair at the dining table. Earl joined him, his hands clasped tightly on the table's surface. The weight of the unspoken words between them was almost suffocating. "What's on your mind, Dad?" Marcus asked cautiously. Earl took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've been thinking about my place here, about how things have been since I moved in." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Earl began, his voice trembling slightly, "that I know how busy you and Denise are. You've got work, the kids, a whole life of your own, and I feel like—" He paused, searching for the right words. Like I'm just in the way. Marcus's face shifted, a mix of confusion and disbelief. In the way? Dad, what are you talking about? Earl's frustration bubbled to the surface. I see it, Marcus. The rushed mornings, the hurried conversations, the way you and Denise look at each other when you think I'm not paying attention. I'm not blind, son. I know you're trying to figure out what to do with me. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. What to do with you? Dad, that's not… Don't lie to me, Earl snapped, his voice rising. I've heard you talking about getting everything ready and making decisions. You don't have to tiptoe around it. If you're planning to send me to a nursing home, just say it. Marcus stared at his father, stunned into silence. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured but tinged with hurt. Is that what you think? That we're trying to get rid of you? What else am I supposed to think? Earl shot back. You barely have time for me. Denise is kind, but even she's stretched thin. I see how tired you both are, and I don't want to be the reason for it. Marcus rubbed his temples, exhaling sharply. Dad, you've got it all wrong. We're not trying to send you anywhere. If anything, we've been trying to figure out how to make things better for you. Earl blinked, the words catching him off guard. Better for me? What does that mean? It means, Marcus said, leaning forward, that we've been working on something for months now. Something to help you feel at home again, to give you the life you deserve. But it's not ready yet, and I didn't want to say anything until it was. Earl's brow furrowed, skepticism creeping in. What kind of something? Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. I can't tell you yet, but I promise you, Dad, it's not what you're thinking. You're not a burden. You've never been a burden. The tension in the room hung heavy as Earl processed his son's words. He wanted to believe Marcus, to trust that his intentions were good, but the doubts that had built up over time were not so easily erased. Then why haven't you said anything? Earl asked, his voice softer now. Why let me sit here feeling like this? Marcus looked down, guilt flickering across his face. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I thought I was protecting you by keeping it a surprise. Maybe I went about it the wrong way. The sincerity in Marcus's voice began to chip away at Earl's defenses. He let out a long sigh, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. I just want to know where I stand, son. That's all. You stand right here, Marcus said firmly. With your family, always. Earl nodded slowly, his emotions too tangled to unravel just yet. All right, but this surprise of yours better be worth all this worry. Marcus cracked a small smile. It will be, Dad, I promise. The confrontation with Marcus left Earl with mixed emotions. The sincerity in his son's voice had been hard to ignore, but the secrecy still gnawed at him. As the days passed, Marcus carried on as if their conversation hadn't happened, leaving Earl to wrestle with his thoughts. He didn't press further, though, perhaps out of fear of what he might uncover. Yet every time Marcus rushed out the door with a cryptic, I'll be back later, Earl's doubts returned, pulling him into a cycle of hope and suspicion. One evening, Earl stood in his room, staring at the suitcase he'd pulled from the back of his closet. The idea of moving into a nursing home hadn't completely left his mind. Maybe Marcus's promises were just words meant to pacify him. The suitcase was an unspoken insurance policy, a way to prepare for what he feared was inevitable. He began packing slowly, folding his clothes with meticulous care. Each item placed in the suitcase felt like a small farewell. He reached for a framed photo of Carol from his nightstand and hesitated, his fingers brushing against the glass. Would she have wanted him to fight harder for his place in the family? Or would she have told him to go gracefully, to protect Marcus from the burden he believed he had become? The sound of Marcus's truck pulling into the driveway broke Earl's thoughts. He set the photo down and moved to the window, watching as Marcus unloaded several wooden planks and cans of paint from the truck bed. Earl's brow furrowed. What kind of project required so much lumber? He decided against asking, unsure if he wanted to know the answer. The next morning, Earl stepped outside to find Marcus tinkering with a set of blueprints spread across the patio table. Marcus looked up and gave a quick smile before rolling the papers away. Morning, Dad, he said casually, brushing sawdust from his hands. What's all this for? Earl asked, gesturing toward the supplies stacked near the garage. Just work stuff, Marcus replied, avoiding eye contact. Big project coming up. Earl nodded slowly, though Marcus's vagueness did little to ease his curiosity. Marcus had always been a hard worker, but this level of intensity was unusual. Earl decided to let it go for now, but the question lingered in his mind. What exactly was Marcus building? Later that day, Earl took his usual walk to the park, seeking the familiar calm of the pond and Hank's steady presence. As expected, Hank was there, perched on the same bench, tossing crumbs to a cluster of ducks. He greeted Earl with a wave and a knowing grin. You look like a man with a lot on his mind, Hank said as Earl sat beside him. Maybe I am, Earl admitted, leaning forward with a sigh. Marcus says he's working on something for me. Won't tell me what, though. Hank chuckled. A man with secrets, huh? Sounds like he's up to something good. You trust him? I want to, Earl said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But I've spent so much time thinking he didn't want me around. It's hard to shake. Let me tell you something, Hank said, his tone serious. When my daughter bought me this fancy recliner a few years back, I thought it was her way of saying, stay put, old man. But you know what she told me? She said, no, Dad, I just want you to be comfortable. Sometimes people show love in ways we don't see right away. Earl nodded thoughtfully, Hank's words settling into the corners of his mind. Maybe Marcus's actions weren't about pushing him away, but about bringing him closer. Still, the secrecy left too much room for doubt. When Earl returned home, the house was unusually quiet. Marcus was in the garage, the hum of his saw breaking the silence. Earl peeked through the window and saw his son meticulously sanding down a piece of wood, his movements focused and deliberate. Denise appeared in the doorway, handing Marcus a water bottle and sharing a brief, hushed conversation. Earl couldn't hear what they were saying, but the looks on their faces suggested something important. That night, Earl sat on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of freshly cut lumber. His suitcase sat in the corner of his room, half packed and waiting. He glanced back at the house, the faint light from Marcus's workbench spilling out into the driveway. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of curiosity stronger than his fear. Whatever Marcus was working on, it wasn't just for work. Earl resolved to wait, to let Marcus reveal his plans in his own time. But the doubts didn't fully fade. Earl couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming, something that would either bring him closer to his family or confirm his deepest fears. The silence of the preparations was both comforting and unsettling, leaving Earl suspended between hope and uncertainty. The nights grew longer for Earl after the silent preparations in Marcus's garage. He noticed small changes. Marcus coming home later, Denise giving him knowing smiles without explanation, and even the kids whispering excitedly when they thought he wasn't listening. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle Earl couldn't see clearly, leaving him restless. The suitcase in his room remained half-packed, a constant reminder of the uncertainty that gnawed at him. One bright Saturday morning, Earl was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and staring out the window at the blooming azaleas in the front yard. Marcus walked in, his demeanor brisk but calm. He set a crisp white shirt and a pair of neatly folded slacks on the table in front of Earl. "Get dressed, Dad," Marcus said with a small smile. "We're taking a trip." Earl blinked, surprised. "A trip? Where to?" "You'll see," Marcus replied cryptically. Denise entered the room a moment later, holding a small bag packed with toiletries and a fresh towel. She placed it next to the shirt and slacks, her smile reassuring but vague. "Everything's ready," she said. "We'll leave in about an hour." Earl's stomach tightened. This was it, wasn't it? The moment he'd been dreading. All the cryptic conversations, the late nights, the hushed excitement, it all pointed to the same conclusion. They were taking him to a nursing home. He nodded stiffly, hiding the lump in his throat, and took the clothes to his room to change. As he buttoned the shirt, he caught sight of the suitcase in the corner. He hesitated for a moment before zipping it shut and carrying it to the front door. If this was the beginning of a new chapter, he would meet it with dignity. The car ride began in silence. Earl sat in the back seat, clutching the suitcase tightly, his knuckles white against the handle. The hum of the engine filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clinking of keys hanging from the ignition. Marcus drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his face unreadable, while Denise sat in the passenger seat, humming softly. Earl recognized the tune. It was a lullaby Carol used to sing to Marcus when he was a boy. The sound stirred a bittersweet ache in his chest. The scenery changed gradually as they left Montgomery. The suburban houses gave way to open fields and rolling hills, dotted with clusters of oak trees. Earl glanced out the window, watching the familiar sights fade into the distance. The road ahead felt endless, stretching into the unknown. "Where are we going?" Earl finally asked, his voice low and uncertain. "You'll see," Marcus repeated, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Denise turned to look at him, her eyes warm but offering no answers. The car climbed a winding road, the dense trees on either side creating a tunnel of greenery. Earl's heart raced as he noticed there were no signs of civilization, no houses, no stores, no landmarks. It felt like they were heading deeper into isolation. The idea of being left in a remote nursing home far from the life he knew gnawed at him. The car slowed as they approached a gravel road leading to a clearing. Earl swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. This was it. He braced himself as Marcus parked and turned off the engine. "All right, Dad," Marcus said, stepping out of the car. He opened the back door and extended a hand to help Earl out. Earl hesitated, his grip on the suitcase tightening, before finally stepping onto the gravel. The crunch of the stones underfoot felt unnervingly final. He adjusted his glasses and looked up, expecting to see the dull, institutional facade of a nursing home. Instead, what greeted him made him freeze in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat, his suitcase slipping from his grasp. Before him stood a house, one that looked strikingly familiar. It was painted a soft, welcoming white, with a wide porch and flower boxes brimming with colorful blooms. The sight was so vivid, so unexpected, that Earl couldn't find his voice. What is this?" he finally managed to whisper, his hands trembling. Marcus stepped forward, his expression softening. "Welcome home, Dad." Earl's knees threatened to buckle as the weight of the moment settled over him. It wasn't just a house. It was his house, the home he and Carol had built together in their younger years, thought to be lost forever. The place where they had raised Marcus, where memories had been etched into every corner. He turned to Marcus, his voice breaking. "You rebuilt it?" Marcus nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Not just me. Denise, the kids, the neighbors, everyone pitched in. It's taken months, but we wanted to surprise you." Earl's gaze shifted back to the house, tears blurring his vision. He didn't need to step inside to know what awaited him. The past wasn't gone. It had been lovingly preserved, brick by brick, memory by memory. For the first time in years, Earl felt something he hadn't dared to hope for, a sense of belonging, a place to call home. The sight of the familiar house lingered in Earl's mind as the car pulled away from the gravel driveway. Marcus had given him just enough time to absorb the moment before promising they'd return soon. "We've got one more stop to make," Marcus had said with a cryptic smile, leaving Earl's heart both full and confused. Where else could they possibly be taking him after a reveal like that? The hum of the car engine filled the silence as they wound their way back down the countryside road. Earl glanced at Marcus, who seemed unusually relaxed, one hand on the wheel and a faint smile on his face. Denise, sitting in the passenger seat, occasionally glanced back at Earl with a knowing expression. The children, usually lively, had been left at home, adding to the sense of solemnity and mystery surrounding the day. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the dense trees on either side casting long shadows as the sun began its descent. Earl couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping back in. While the sight of his rebuilt home had stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years, this unplanned detour rekindled his doubts. Was this really about him? Or was it another attempt to ease the transition into something he had resisted for so long? "Where are we going now?" Earl finally asked, his voice hesitant. "You'll see," Marcus replied, the same cryptic smile playing on his lips. It was a phrase Earl had come to resent, a deflection that only fueled his growing suspicion. They approached a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of a nearby town. The structure was gray and unremarkable, its windows reflecting the fading sunlight. Earl's chest tightened. This was it. This was the place they hadn't wanted to mention. The car slowed to a crawl and Marcus turned into the parking lot. Earl's pulse quickened as he scanned the building. The sign above the entrance was worn, the letters barely legible, but he could just make out the words, Hilltop Rehabilitation and Care Center, a nursing home. He had been right all along. Marcus put the car in park and turned to look at Earl. "We're here," he said simply. Earl's hands gripped the edge of his seat, his mind racing. He had braced himself for this moment, convinced it was coming, but seeing it confirmed made his chest ache in a way he hadn't anticipated. He glanced at Marcus, searching for some sign of regret or hesitation in his son's face, but Marcus's expression remained neutral. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Earl asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell you what," Marcus replied, his tone calm but unreadable. "That this is where I'd end up," Earl said, his words tinged with both resignation and hurt. "You could have just said it instead of all this, whatever this is." For a moment, Marcus didn't answer. Then to Earl's surprise, a smile broke across his face, softening his features. "We're not staying here, Dad." "What?" Earl blinked, caught off guard. Marcus gestured toward the building with a chuckle. "This isn't for you. I just needed to drop off some papers for a client. Figured we'd take care of it while we were out." Earl's confusion deepened. "What client?" "Long story," Marcus said with a shrug, already stepping out of the car. "I'll be back in a minute. Sit tight." As Marcus disappeared into the building, Earl sat back in his seat, his thoughts a jumbled mix of relief and frustration. The knot in his chest began to loosen, but the emotional roller coaster of the day left him feeling drained. Denise turned in her seat, her warm smile doing little to mask her amusement at Earl's reaction. "You thought this was it, didn't you?" she asked gently. Earl sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know what I thought." Denise reached out, resting a hand on his. "Trust Marcus, Dad. He knows what he's doing." Earl wanted to believe her. The image of his rebuilt home flashed in his mind, a beacon of hope against the lingering doubts. But trust was a hard thing to give when so much of his life had felt out of his control. A few minutes later, Marcus returned, climbing into the driver's seat with a satisfied nod. "All done," he announced, starting the engine. "Now we can get back to the good stuff." Earl looked at him, his expression a mix of exasperation and amusement. "You could have warned me, you know." "And ruined the surprise," Marcus replied, grinning. "Where's the fun in that?" The car eased back onto the road, the tension in the air beginning to lift. Earl shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth despite himself. Whatever Marcus was planning, it wasn't what Earl had feared. For now, that was enough to quiet the doubts still lingering in the back of his mind. The drive from the detour felt lighter, though Earl's mind still raced with questions. Marcus's casual grin and Denise's warm assurances had eased some of the tension, but the day's twists had left him on edge. He glanced out the window, watching the landscape shift once more, the familiar countryside giving way to a stretch of open fields. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. "Almost there," Marcus announced, his voice steady, yet holding an air of anticipation. Earl looked at his son, searching his face for a clue, but Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the road. The car turned onto a gravel path, the crunch of the tires breaking the serene quiet of the rural backdrop. Earl's grip on the door tightened as they approached a clearing. Then the car came to a stop. Earl stepped out cautiously, his shoes crunching on the gravel. At first, the sight before him didn't register, but as he adjusted his glasses, his breath caught. In front of him stood a house, not just any house, but his house, the home he and Carol had built together all those years ago. The house he had believed lost forever. It was pristine, as if pulled straight from his memories. The white-painted walls gleamed in the soft light. The porch railing stood sturdy and inviting, and flower boxes brimming with bright blooms adorned the windows. For a moment, Earl thought he was dreaming. What? How? Earl stammered, his voice trembling as he took a step forward. His suitcase slipped from his hand, forgotten in the rush of emotions washing over him. Marcus stepped up beside him, his expression soft. Welcome home, Dad. Earl turned to his son, his eyes wide with disbelief. You rebuilt it? How? Why? Marcus smiled, his voice calm but full of emotion. It wasn't just me. Denise, the kids, the neighbors, they all helped. We wanted to give you something back, a place where you could feel like yourself again. Earl's knees buckled slightly and Marcus caught his arm, steadying him. Careful, Dad, he said gently. Come on, let's go inside. With Marcus's support, Earl climbed the steps to the porch, his fingers brushing over the smooth, freshly painted railing. The scent of pine and varnish filled the air, each step feeling both surreal and familiar. When Marcus pushed the door open, Earl gasped. The interior was a perfect blend of the old and the new. The polished wood floors gleamed, the walls were painted in warm, welcoming tones, and the furniture echoed the cozy charm he and Carol had once created together. On the mantel above the fireplace, a framed photograph of Earl and Carol on their wedding day caught his eye. Their smiles, frozen in time, brought a lump to his throat. Marcus, I don't know what to say, Earl whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Marcus replied. Just take it all in. Earl wandered through the house, each room a treasure trove of memories. In the kitchen, he found Carol's favorite cookie jar sitting on the counter, still bearing the small chip from one of Marcus's childhood accidents. In the bedroom, the quilt Carol had painstakingly stitched years ago lay neatly folded on the bed. Every detail spoke of love, care, and an understanding of what this home had meant to him. As he returned to the living room, Earl noticed a thick photo album sitting on the coffee table. He opened it cautiously, the scent of aged paper mingling with the smell of fresh wood. Inside were photographs he hadn't seen in years. Carol planting roses in the garden, Marcus as a boy grinning with missing teeth, family gatherings filled with laughter. We managed to save some things, Marcus said, sitting down beside Earl. And for the things we couldn't, the neighbors pitched in. Everyone wanted to make this place feel like home again. Earl's vision blurred with tears as he turned each page. You didn't have to do this, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I was a burden, that you didn't want me around. Marcus shook his head, his tone firm but gentle. You've never been a burden, Dad. You raised me, gave me everything. This is just my way of giving something back. Earl closed the album, clutching it to his chest. He looked at Marcus, his son's face a mixture of pride and love. I don't deserve this, he whispered. Yes, you do, Marcus said simply. You've always deserved it. The sound of laughter broke the emotional moment. Earl turned to see Denise and the kids standing in the doorway, their smiles wide and welcoming. The kids ran to him, their arms wrapping around his waist. For the first time in years, Earl felt not just love, but belonging. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the house, Earl sat on the porch with his family. The weight that had pressed on him for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable peace. This wasn't just a house. It was a home, built with love and dedication, and a promise that he would never face life alone. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers from the garden. Earl sat on the porch, still overwhelmed by the day's events. His home, thought lost forever, had been lovingly restored. The laughter of Denise and the kids echoed behind him as they explored the house, filling it with life once again. But Earl's thoughts drifted back to the one thing still missing, the companion he had thought he'd lost after the fire, his old horse, Buddy. As if on cue, Marcus emerged from the driveway, a sly grin on his face. Dad, there's one more thing you need to see, he said, gesturing for Earl to follow him. Earl hesitated, the weight of the day's emotions leaving him cautious. What are you up to now, son? Marcus chuckled. Just trust me. He led Earl down a narrow path that wrapped around the side of the house, opening to a small, freshly built barn nestled against a backdrop of trees. The structure was simple, but sturdy, its fresh wood glowing faintly in the moonlight. Earl's heart began to race as he caught a glimpse of movement inside. Marcus swung the barn door open, and Earl froze. There, standing in a freshly strawed stall, was Buddy. His coat was a little grayer, his mane a bit thinner, but his eyes were unmistakable. The old horse let out a soft whinny, stepping forward as if he recognized Earl instantly. "Buddy!" Earl exclaimed, his voice cracking. Tears filled his eyes as he stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached out to stroke the horse's nose. Buddy nuzzled into him, a soft, familiar warmth Earl hadn't felt in years. I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, a satisfied smile on his face. After the fire, Buddy wandered off. A neighbor found him a few towns over and kept him safe until we could bring him back. Earl turned to Marcus, his voice choked with emotion. "You didn't just save the house. You brought him home too." Marcus shrugged, but his expression was tender. "I knew he meant a lot to you. We couldn't let him stay gone." Earl lingered in the stall, running his hands along Buddy's coat, his heart swelling with gratitude. The horse had been more than a companion during his years on the farm. Buddy had been a symbol of the life Earl and Carol had built together, a steadfast presence through years of hard work and joy. Having him back felt like reclaiming another piece of that life. Later, as Earl walked back to the house with Marcus, he couldn't shake the sense of completeness that had settled over him. For years, he had carried the weight of loss, believing he was alone in his memories of the past. But now, as he looked at his son, he realized how much Marcus had carried for him, silently and selflessly. "You did all of this for me," Earl said quietly, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded. "You gave me everything, Dad. This was the least I could do." Earl paused, his eyes searching his son's face. "I don't think I've said it enough, but I'm proud of you, Marcus. Not just for this, everything. The man you've become." Marcus's expression softened, his voice steady. "You've always been my dad. None of this would have been possible without the foundation you gave me." The two men walked back to the porch where Denise and the kids had gathered, their laughter spilling into the quiet night. Earl sat down, watching as his grandchildren played on the steps. Buddy's whinny carried softly from the barn, a comforting sound that melted into the peaceful evening. For the first time in years, Earl felt truly at home. This wasn't just about the house or the horse. It was about the love that had brought it all together. It was about a family that had never stopped caring, even when Earl had doubted it himself. As the night deepened, Earl leaned back in his chair, the stars twinkling above. The future no longer felt uncertain. Instead, it felt like a gift, one he was ready to embrace, surrounded by the people he loved most. The next morning brought with it a calm that Earl hadn't felt in years. The warm light filtered through the kitchen windows as the aroma of coffee brewed by Denise filled the house. Earl sat at the dining table, the photo album Marcus had gifted him the night before still resting in front of him. As he flipped through the pages once more, a profound sense of gratitude welled up in his chest. Everything, his home, Buddy, the memories lovingly preserved, had been a labor of love, a testament to the lengths his family had gone to for him. Marcus entered the room, his work boots tapping lightly on the wooden floor. "Good morning, Dad," he greeted, pouring himself a cup of coffee before sitting across from Earl. "Morning, son," Earl replied, his voice steady but warm. He paused, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "I've been thinking about everything you've done. The house, Buddy, all of it. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Marcus said with a small smile. "This isn't about thanks, Dad. It's about making sure you know how much you mean to us." Earl nodded slowly, his thoughts turning inward. "You know, for a long time I thought I was just in the way, that I'd lived past my purpose. But seeing all this, knowing how much you've done, I see now that I was wrong." Marcus reached across the table, placing a firm but gentle hand on his father's. "You've never been in the way, Dad. You've been our foundation, even when you didn't realize it. This house, everything we've built, it all started with what you gave us." The sincerity in Marcus's words settled over Earl like a balm, soothing the doubts that had lingered for so long. As they sat in comfortable silence, Denise appeared in the doorway, holding a basket filled with gardening tools. "Marcus," she called with a smile, "did you show Dad the backyard yet?" Marcus grinned and stood, motioning for Earl to follow. Curious, Earl rose from his chair and joined his son and daughter-in-law as they stepped outside. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The backyard, once overgrown and unkempt, had been transformed into a thriving garden. Rows of vegetables and herbs stretched out beneath the morning sun, their leaves glistening with dew. Flowers of every color bordered the garden, their blooms bright and cheerful. A small wooden bench sat beneath an old oak tree, offering a perfect spot for reflection. Earl's hand instinctively went to his chest as emotion swelled within him. "You did this too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Denise nodded. "The kids helped plant everything last week. We thought it might be nice for you to have a place to grow things again, like you used to." Earl stepped closer, his fingers brushing over the soft petals of a sunflower. Memories of the garden he and Carol had tended together flooded back. Her laughter as they worked side by side, the pride they felt as they watched their hard work blossom into life. "It's beautiful," Earl said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Marcus replied. "Just enjoy it." Earl knelt beside a row of tomato plants, his hands instinctively checking the soil's moisture. It felt natural, like slipping back into a rhythm he thought he'd forgotten. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose reignite within him. As the morning unfolded, the family joined Earl in the garden. Marcus worked alongside him, helping to stake the plants, while Denise guided the children as they watered the flowers. The air was filled with laughter and the soft rustling of leaves, a harmony that spoke of love in its purest form. By the time the sun began its descent, Earl stood at the edge of the garden, his hands dirty but his heart light. He turned to Marcus and Denise, his expression one of deep gratitude. "You didn't just rebuild a house," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You rebuilt my spirit." Marcus placed an arm around his father's shoulders. "We just gave back a little of what you've always given us, Dad." As they walked back toward the house, Earl glanced over his shoulder at the garden. It wasn't just a patch of earth. It was a promise of new beginnings, a place where love had been planted and would continue to grow. The evening sky painted hues of orange and purple over the horizon as Earl sat on the porch, the warmth of the day still lingering in the air. The scent of fresh soil clung to his hands, a testament to the hours he had spent in the garden with his family. For the first time in years, Earl felt not only a sense of peace, but also a profound connection to his past, his present, and the future unfolding before him. Dinner was a lively affair. The long wooden table in the dining room was adorned with plates of food, fried chicken, cornbread, fresh vegetables from the garden. The kids chattered excitedly about their day, their laughter filling the house. Denise and Marcus moved easily around the room, refilling drinks and ensuring everyone had enough. Earl sat at the head of the table, a seat he hadn't occupied in years, feeling every bit the patriarch he once was. As the meal wound down, Marcus tapped his glass with a spoon, drawing everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," he began, his voice steady but warm. "Dad, this house, this garden, this family, it's all because of you. You've been the heart of everything good in our lives. And today, sitting here, I realize just how much we've been able to come back to because of you." Earl blinked, overwhelmed, as everyone raised their glasses in his honor. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "I spent a long time thinking I was a burden," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you've all shown me something I didn't see before. Family isn't about what you take from each other. It's about what you build together. And this," he gestured around the room, his eyes glistening, "this is the most beautiful thing we've ever built." The applause that followed wasn't just polite. It was heartfelt, a tangible expression of the love that filled the room. Later that evening, Earl returned to the porch with Marcus. The two men sat in companionable silence, the night air cool and filled with the sound of crickets. The rebuilt house stood behind them, its windows glowing warmly against the dark. "You know," Earl began, breaking the silence, When I first thought about leaving, it wasn't because I didn't love you or Denise. It was because I didn't want to hold you back." Marcus turned to his father, his expression serious. "You never held us back, Dad. You've always been the reason we push forward." Earl nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "I see that now, and I see that I still have something to offer, not just memories, but something real." "More than something," Marcus said with a small smile. "You've always been the foundation, Dad. We just had to remind you of that." As the conversation settled into another comfortable pause, the faint sound of hooves drew Earl's attention. He turned to see Buddy grazing peacefully near the garden, his presence a comforting reminder of the life Earl had once thought was lost. The sight brought a smile to Earl's face, one filled with contentment and gratitude. In the days that followed, Earl found a renewed sense of purpose. He spent mornings in the garden, teaching his grandchildren how to care for the plants, just as Carol had once taught him. Afternoons were filled with stories, reminiscences of his youth, tales of Carol's humor and strength, and lessons learned from years of hard work. The house, once a place of emptiness and loss, now thrummed with life and laughter. Neighbors stopped by often, bringing baked goods or simply sitting on the porch to chat. Earl welcomed them all, his spirit revitalized by the connections he had once feared were slipping away. The garden flourished under his care, becoming a symbol of resilience and renewal for everyone who saw it. One evening, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, Earl turned to Marcus and Denise, his heart full. "I thought I had lost everything," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "But what I see now is that I've gained something even greater. This family, this home, it's everything I could have ever hoped for." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder, his own eyes shining with emotion. "You deserve it, Dad, every bit of it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final rays of light across the fields, Earl leaned back in his chair, the weight of his past finally lifting. This wasn't just a new beginning. It was a continuation of everything he had built with love, now carried forward by the people who meant the most to him. The stars began to emerge, twinkling in the vast expanse of the sky. Earl closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of his family around him. The distant call of Buddy, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. He had spent so much time believing he was a burden, only to realize he had always been a blessing. With a contented smile, Earl opened his eyes and looked at Marcus. "Home isn't a place," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. "It's the love that builds it." And as the night wrapped itself around the house, Earl knew, without a doubt, that he was home.